with supervised by Roya. And his work focuses on identifying the different interferences that can degrade the free flow of information on the internet.
Hi, I'm Diwan from University of Michigan, presenting our recent work, TSPU, Russia's Decentralized National Firewall. So in March 2022, just days after the onset of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the federal government of Russia started to block social media and news websites on a national scale. This escalation of blocking quickly transformed Russia's internet into a propaganda bubble that is hostile to Russian citizens' ability to, oh, sorry about that, I thought, yeah, this was this escalation of blocking quickly transformed Russia's internet into a propaganda bubble. Now, with global internet censorship on the rise across all countries, there is a need for better understanding, especially in the case of Russia, where the government achieved such tight control in such a short time. But first, let's cover some history on how censorship has been practiced in Russia, and how their censorship apparatus evolved over the last decade from a singular block list to a decentralized national firewall. So 10 years ago, in 2012, the infamous blocklist law was signed, which claims to protect children from illegal contents. And the law was implemented as a singular blocklist called Blocking Registry, which is maintained and updated by the federal agency Roskomnadzor, who is in charge of the nationwide Russian internet censorship. And ISPs fetch the list from Roskomnadzor periodically and are obligated to block websites from the list. So for years after the law was signed, censorship in Russia followed a model called decentralized control, meaning Roskomnadzor controls the content of a singular block list, determining which domains are harmful, which are not, but ISPs were at discretion to implement how to block them. And as a result, ISP use different blocking mechanisms. Some interfere with DNS, some on application layer. And the amount of blocking also varies from ISP to ISP. Some more faithfully enforce the block list than others. So within that model, it was difficult for the federal government to enforce censorship policies in real time and uniformly across the country. As a result, the RUNET law was signed in 2019 that appoints Roskomnadzor to implement, I quote, special purpose DPIs to counter threats to Russia's internet. And importantly, this law provides a legal basis for requiring ISPs to install these devices in their network, these government-supplied devices. So not long after the law was signed, Russian ISPs started to receive letters from Roskomnadzor requesting information on their networks, and also receive these black box DPIs along with installation instructions. And this figure here is an example of leaked documents by an ISP on where in the network these devices need to be installed. These black box devices, which are shown by the red circles in the figure, are later known as TSPU devices. And then, about a year later, Russian users online started to notice blocking of contents and domains that were not found inside the blocking registry. We call it out-registry blocking. Further investigation by Russian activists suggest these blockings showed temporal and geographical uniformity. And one of such events is a Twitter throttling incident last year. Our team observed practically identical throttling behavior and implementation-specific features across numerous ISPs. And later that year, actually, a member of the Russian parliament publicly acknowledged that Twitter's throttling incident was the first time TSPU was put into use on a massive scale. And that all major ISPs had already installed them while installation for smaller ISPs were underway. And this observation of uniform censorship behavior in Russia was also corroborated by other measurements observatory like UNI. And this figure, the lower data points signal throttling. And you can see that this particular throttling event stopped across many ISPs around the same time. So we want to highlight that all these events after 2019 marked a departure from Russia's previous censorship approach, which had been relying on block list and ISP compliance. And this suggests the existence of an emerging censorship system that enables Russian government to enforce censorship in a centrally coordinated manner. But beyond its existence, very little is known about this TSPU system. So now that we covered the backgrounds on censorship practice, let's jump in to investigate the TSPUs in details. TSPU stands for Technical Measures to Combat Threats, and you can think of them as custom DPIs, custom-made DPIs devices distributed by Roskomnadzor. These devices empower Roskomnadzor to centrally control Russia's internet while keeping the benefits of operating in distributed ISPs. But to perform measurements on TSPU, there are several challenges. First, for in-country measurements, we need to acquire a appropriate vantage point inside Russia. And the fact that only residential networks are targeted but data centers are exempted further complicates the issue. And distinguishing TSPU from other DPIs is not trivial either, because Russian ISPs still keep their commercial filters in place, which censor many of the same resources. And finally, we found that the TSPU censorship policies are not symmetric with respect to inside and outside Russia. That makes the existing remote measurement platforms unfit for detecting TSPU and therefore requiring ad hoc solutions. In this study, we asked how, what, and where of TSPU's interference with Russian users' internet traffic. And first, let's discover how TSPU tracks and blocks a violating connection. So to attribute and observe censorship behavior to TSPU, we first need to design a method that helps us distinguish between TSPU and ISP blocking. The key insight that helps us here is that for blocking initiated by TSPU, we expect the blocking implementation as well as its targets to be uniform across our vantage points, and because they are centrally controlled and coordinated. And for example, one of the implementation on SNI-based blocking, we see that after triggering SNI, all packets from the server side are dropped and the reset add injected. We also combine blocking behaviors with network locations of where the network interferences happen, because we expect that they are co-located together if implemented by TSPU. So in total, we identified 6 unique blocking behaviors that we reliably attribute to TSPU, which are implemented to target SNI, IP, and the QUIC protocol. We noticed that each of these blocking mechanisms requires either dropping or modifying packets. And this shows that TSPUs are in-pass devices. And this is alarming because by being in-pass, TSPU have more means to interfere with users' traffic compared to on-pass systems like the Great Firewall of China. And we also found TSPUs are stateful when it comes to inspecting and possible blocking of connections. Like here, we can see that sequences containing a SIM packet sent from the remote side shows different behaviors from other sequences, and some of them actually provide us with valid circumvention strategies. We identify which part of packet triggers TSPU censorship, which part of packet, how reliably they are triggered, and the degree of statefulness when it comes to when TSPU makes blocking decisions. I refer you to the paper for more details. Next, we look at what are being targeted by TSPU. We constructed 2 lists of domains for testing, one with samples from the blocking registry, and the other with top domains from ranking services and censorship testing domains from Citizen Lab. The later two are used to discover out-registry domains that TSPU blocks. Now that we know the behavior from TSPU, we have a clear signal of ISP blockings where we have vantage points in, we ran measurements to these 20K domains to see the overlapping of TSPU and ISP censorship. So not only we discovered dozens of out-registry domains that TSPU secretly blocks targets, we also found that TSPU blocks almost all in-country, almost all in-registry domains that ISPs are already obligated to block. So we believe this means that the previous censorship model that relies on ISP compliance has been superseded by this TSPU approach. So we found over 9,800 domains blocked on TSPU. But what are these domains? Well, using the off-the-shelf categorization services is not viable because most of them are in Russian. And so we use talk modeling by clustering the HTML pages from control machines and identifying common themes for each cluster with the help of Russian-speaking collaborators. We found that informative media are being heavily targeted, which includes personal blogs, news agencies, and social media. Finally, we designed ad hoc measurements to detect and locate TSPU devices with respect to Russian users. To start with, we determined the network location of TSPU devices that are installed in the upstream of Russian vantage points owned by the team. We did TTL-based measurements by assigning the trigger with increasing TTL values. And from all local vantage points, measurements suggested that TSPU devices were located close to end users, usually only within 1 or 2 hops away, actually. But such local measurements are limited by the number of in-country vantage points we had. On the other hand, remotely triggering TSPU is far from trivial because it only applies blocking to connections that originate within Russia, going outside but not in the other direction. So for this, we use 2 ad hoc measurements to be able to remotely detect it. The first is based on public echo servers on the internet, combined with asymmetric routing, which is very common in Russia, in order to confuse the TSPU, confuse the TSPU which side of Russia this connection originates from. The next one, which I will explain next, exploits how TSPU handles fragmented IP packets. So briefly, we found that not only TSPU buffers IP fragments like many other middle boxes do, it also handles the fragments in a very unique way. The figure on the left shows that incoming fragments are buffered at the TSPU, but when the last fragment arrives, it does not reassemble them, but instead forward each fragment individually. And when doing so, it overrides the TTL field of the second to last fragments with the TTL of the first fragment. And also imposed a limit of 45 fragments as a maximum queue size for a single IP packet. We investigate this limit of 45, and we note that it differs from the default setting for major firewalls. And with internet scale scanning, we found this value to be extremely unique. So we used this limit of 45 to see if the TSPU is on path, and then to precisely locate the TSPU, we exploit the fact that it overrides TTL when it forwards continuing fragments. And we scanned over 4 million endpoints in Russia for the presence and also the location of TSPU devices, within trace routes to each endpoint that we observed TSPU blockings. And we color the network links where the TSPU sits. This is what it looks like. We identified over 6,000 unique TSPU devices on Russia's internet, even though we believe this is still an underestimation due to the limitation of the technique. And you can see that they are deployed closer to network leaves, closer to end users, rather than to backbone networks. So in fact, in over 70% cases, the installation location is within only 2 hops away. This deployment location and also the substantial number of devices, we believe it suggests that Russia is taking a path different from the Great Firewall of China by forming a decentralized national firewall. And for some cases where we noticed TSPU are further away from users, we found that the device we identified is located inside the upstream ISPs. And again, due to the limitation of our techniques, we were only able to identify and locate the first TSPU we see, so there might be additional installation locations along the path. But it is also possible that downstream ISPs rely on their providers to be considered compliant with the requirement, and in that case, this is explicitly allowed by the TSPU law. So based on what we learned, how can user in Russia behind a TSPU device bypass its censorship? There are several options. Technical users can adopt client-side strategies such as TCP IP fragmentation or TLS padding, which, however, requires modifying client OS or application. And on the other hand, there are 2 server-side strategies that are able to help unmodified clients to bypass TSPU blockings, such as by announcing a small TCP window to break up the client hello, or by responding send with send to start a split handshake. So to wrap up, our study characterized TSPU, centrally controlled censorship system in Russia with pervasive deployment. We are concerned that TSPU have changed the censorship model in Russia. Now the federal government can implement unilaterally uniform censorship across thousands of privately owned ISPs in real time, without relying on ISP compliance or their technical capabilities. And what's more, TSPU stands out from other censorship systems by being both in-path and closer to network edges. So this makes TSPU more suitable for other attacks beyond censorship, like targeted surveillance or interception. And finally, while we focus on Russia, we fear this new model of decentralized deployment and centralized control may become a blueprint for other countries. We note that for most countries where networks are commercialized, it is very challenging to imitate a highly centralized information control scheme like Iran's or China's, which requires strict control over countries' network infrastructure. But as we have seen in Russia's case, with laws, policies, and also government-supplied DPIs, the authorities are still able to unilaterally roll out censorship measures, regardless of lack of direct ownership of ISPs. And considering that Russia has a history of exporting censorship net technologies, we should monitor for their potential deployment in other regions. And thank you. With that, I would like to open the floor for questions.